Hi, I'm Tom Field, Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you to today's session entitled Embrace Full-Scale Cloud Adoption with a Comprehensive Cloud Data Management Strategy. Your presenters today are John Downey, VP of Sales with Acronis SCS, and Huayra Shafiq, Director of Product with Virtru. Now, before I turn this over to our speakers, let me give you just a little bit of background on today's session. Like many risk-averse organizations, state and local governments are missing out on the benefits of full-scale cloud adoption because they're often paralyzed by the complexities associated with trusting their data to a third party. It's no surprise that government agencies have concerns about storing citizen data in the cloud, considering that a total of 4.5 billion records were compromised in the first half of 2018 alone. So how do you embrace the advantages of the cloud and remain in control of your data? Well, in this session today, our experts will share a comprehensive cloud data management strategy that will put the benefits of full-scale cloud adoption within reach. Both Virtru and Acronis will share their experiences in accelerating the cloud migration efforts of state and local governments and the strategies they employed. Specifically, they'll cover the importance of data-centric encryption, 4 pillars of key management in a cloud environment, and finally, incorporating backup and disaster recovery into your data protection strategy. I do want to take just a moment to tell you a bit about my organization, Information Security Media Group. We currently publish more than 24 international media sites. We have Bank Info Security and CU Info Security for financial services, Gov Info Security for the public sector, and Healthcare Info Security for the medical community. We also publish Info Risk Today, Data Breach Today, and Careers Info Security. Every one of these sites is dedicated to providing education and news regarding information security, but specifically tailored to their individual sectors. With over 750,000 members registered to our sites, we've created a true global information source that tackles the key issues of interest to our unique audience. Just a few notes of housekeeping, please. If you have any questions for our speakers during the course of this session, you can submit them anytime via the chat window that you see on your screen. Similarly, if anyone should experience any technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please dial the number that you see on your screen now. If you dial extension 134, we do have technical support staff standing by to help. Finally, I need to emphasize, the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material. As such, it's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use any of the information presented in today's session, or if you're looking for customized training material, please contact us. Now let's meet our sponsors today. Up first is Acronis SCS. Now, Acronis SCS is an American cyber protection and edge data security company dedicated to delivering products designed to meet the unique requirements of the U.S. public sector. The company's innovative backup, anti-ransomware, disaster recovery, and enterprise file sync and share products ensure data security across federal, state, and local governments, education, and nonprofit organizations. Acronis SCS products are built and supported in the United States by U.S. citizens and validated by third-party agencies. The company is headquartered in Scottsdale, Arizona. And let's meet Virtru. Virtru understands that data is an organization's most valuable asset and that sharing it is critical for business success. But sharing data creates significant risk. Virtru believes that no one should have to choose between protecting data and sharing it. It helps more than 5,000 organizations, large and small, across almost every industry, protect data wherever it's created or shared so that they can collaborate with confidence. Virtru provides the power to get the job done. Now let's meet our speakers today. You're going to hear from John Downey, VP of Sales with Acronis SCS. He's got 15 years of experience selling enterprise information security and data protection software to the U.S. public sector. He's got deep expertise in mapping product capabilities to key U.S. federal government policies, creating enterprise license agreements for systems integrators, and developing sales and channel strategies to maximize customer attainment and satisfaction. And of course, you'll also be meeting Huayra Shafiq, Director of Product with Virtru. He's been with Virtru since 2017, initially joining to create and lead enterprise deployment strategy, and then transitioning into a leadership role on the product team. He's responsible for overseeing Virtru's file protection portfolio. Prior to Virtru, he was building products at O-Power, a successful Washington, D.C. green tech startup. His passion for uncovering problems and creating solutions for people has been a primary motivator throughout his career. And with that, it's my privilege to turn this over now to Haris and to John. Gentlemen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Tom. So today we're going to be talking about cloud and IT modernization barriers, best practices for strengthening data and privacy controls, data-centric encryption, and the 4 pillars of key management, self-protecting data, and finally, some SLED success stories. So when we think about full-scale cloud migrations, what holds enterprises up is really the question that we are trying to answer. There are many factors that prevent organizations from moving to the cloud. Those factors include industry. If you're in a regulated environment or hold large amounts of intellectual property, you likely can't move all your data to the cloud due to compliance policies. We know this is extremely true for SLED organizations that have both HIPAA data as well as CJIS data. Lacking in resources can also be an issue that many organizations deal with. Shrinking operating margins and limited resources often create a skill gap in the security space. Legacy buildup of data is another issue that organizations deal with. Enterprises have to sort through mountains of data. Sometimes it could be billions of files to determine what types of files are in their environment, where they're located, and how that data is classified before developing a strategy of where this data can go and how it can be moved to the cloud. And finally, this all surmounts to a reasonable amount of risk. Risk can also be seen as data is moved into the cloud when not setting proper compliance policies, lacking resources, and when considering legacy buildup. You might be wondering how to balance IT security policies, move data and workloads into the cloud, and keep business operations running, because without the right technology in place, there's a risk of being breached, and the consequences of a breach could have major implications on the reputation and health of your organization. It's important to consider data privacy best practices when moving your data into the cloud. Data in its many forms and places is simply hard to manage. And without the right privacy and security technologies in place, it can be a major vulnerability for your organization. It's often also the lifeblood of your organization. And so when thinking about this lifeblood, we have 5 best practices that will give you the most control over your data and ensure it stays private and secure at every stage of your cloud journey. Step 1 is to classify your data. Data classification and discovery is an important first step because it helps you identify all the places your data is located in your environment. And 2, it helps you determine what's too sensitive to migrate in the clear based off of your own classification rules. Breaking your data into 4 categories can often be helpful. Those categories are classified data, restricted data, private data, and public data. You can adopt these classifications for your own organization or create ones that make more sense. Having classifications will make your cloud migration easier to execute. Once you've classified data, assigning data policies is the next step. Determining what kinds of control and protection each tier should receive is important. For example, consider policies like access control, watermarking, and expiration dates on files based on the set level of sensitivity. And only share these controls with authorized users. Once you've classified and assigned data policies, establishing attribute-based authentication and control will give you the ability to track everything that happens to your data in the cloud and immediately mitigate risk. Security-focused tools like auditability and automatic notifications will allow you to identify anomalies in your environment so that you can take fast action after you've identified outliers and immediately cut off access. Conducting third-party audits is another important component to data privacy best practices. All it takes is one weak link in your supply chain to expose your data. Some industries like healthcare, which account for 1/3 of all the potentially compromised records, are particularly susceptible to value chain attacks. This is also true of criminal justice information. You can reduce the risk by conducting penetration testing and SOC audits with your both internally, viewing and auditing your vendor's access control policies to the data that you established earlier in the steps. And step 5 is backup often and store in multiple places. If you're regularly doing backups and storing them, disaster recovery purposes, you put yourself in a much better position to recover from any issues and outages that you may experience. In addition to these best practices, working with the right cloud provider is also a critical part of your digital transformation. The key is to find a provider that makes it easy to get started, but also one that's transparent about their own data policies. You should have a clear understanding of what they will do with your data and what they won't do with your data. Avoiding black box vendors at all costs should be a primary concern. Being skeptical of your data in the cloud is completely fine, but things like locking yourself into working with a single vendor or blindly trusting one will definitely put you at risk. The key is to protect the data itself to ensure perpetual control over it. When we think about protecting data itself, the first concept that we think about is key management. It's at the heart of data encryption, but when it comes to key management, it's important to understand first how encryption in the cloud works. There's two common forms of encryption used today: symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt your data. This can be as simple as a PDF document with a password protection on it, or as complex as an SDK platform that allows developers to encrypt their own data and return it with the same key used to encrypt. Asymmetric encryption uses two keys rather than one. One key encrypts the data, and a separate key is used to decrypt the data. Anyone can send out an email or a file encrypted with the recipient's public key, but only the recipient can read it, since they have private decryption key rights. In addition to symmetric and asymmetric keys, there are 4 pillars of key management that must be considered. The first is key storage. Common email and file sharing providers usually store both the keys and contents on their own servers. This means that they can have access and read your unencrypted data whenever they want. Asymmetric encryption technologies prevent unwanted third-party access to your unencrypted data by keeping encryption and decryption keys solely in your hands. Since keys enable users to unlock your data, it's important to verify recipients' identities before granting them this access. Authentication, step 2, verifies who can access encryption keys. The primary role of encryption keys is to protect data, but they can also add control capabilities to give a piece of content specific control. Policy management allows you to add and adjust these capabilities. For instance, you can revoke or disable resharing on a document and the access around it. Finally, authorization verifies the actions users can take on encrypted data once they've been authenticated. Authorization enforces encryption key policies, ensure you always maintain control of your data. And now I'll pass it off to John.
So to exemplify the importance of these 4 elements that Horace just went over here, I'd like to tell a little story. As a backup and recovery vendor, an OEM that creates software as a manufacturer, one of the things that we provide with our backup and disaster recovery solution is encrypted data at rest as well as in transit with AES 256-bit encryption. And while that's great, we do not store keys on behalf of our customers. So the importance here on the authorization piece and the policy management specifically is that you need to have at least more than one individual within your environment who has the keys to the kingdom, as it were. We've had 2 situations recently this year where we had state and local government customers contact us in a panic because the sysadmin who was basically monitoring all of their backup and restore policies using the Acronis SCS solution decided to leave the organization under unfavorable terms. And with him, he took the encryption passwords to unlock basically the backup files that they had been taking for years, storing in an on-site repository. And the organization had no way, basically, of going back into those files and pulling out pertinent data that they needed to when a recovery situation took place. So just want to reiterate that these 4 pillars of key management here are something to seriously be considered and to develop policy around, so that you're leveraging the tools that exist in the marketplace, as well as having sound policy management to dictate the authorization and make sure that you're replicating the ability for somebody in your organization, if it so needs to happen, go in and access pertinent data that has been sent encrypted either by your own efforts in your organization or by the vendor with whom you've contracted to provide services and software on your behalf. So I'd like to take a moment here and just discuss the evolution of threats as it pertains to unwanted viewers accessing data, whether it's external or internal to an environment. And if we look at the lifeblood of an organization, which is obviously the data, it typically sits at the core, right, either in a data center, but more and more we're seeing proliferation of important data across a network and through an environment, bleeding out to the edge, as it were. And the traditional method for deploying security policy and tools against the prevention of, or for the prevention of inadvertent access and unwanted eyeballs taking a look at the data, we have what's known as this outside-in perimeter defense that historically has driven both the marketplace as well as the policy of organizations. When I say the marketplace, I mean the cybersecurity and information protection marketplace. So in the beginning, firewalls, obviously, when networks became more prevalent, were considered as the key factor, right? Building that moat around the castle. So you had firewalls, which obviously do their job and are necessary even today. Things like intrusion detection systems, like the Dragon and Terrasis model. These tools and the policy set there, well, let's just make our fortress as impenetrable as possible, and therefore we're going to just prevent anybody from the outside getting into the environment that shouldn't be in there. And eventually, of course, those things proved to be not infallible. And so another concentric circle was developed around the vulnerability detection and management, where organizations and leaders of IT teams said, well, we know if somebody really wants to get into our environment, that they're going to, one way or another. So we now need to understand if and when they are inside the environment, where will they likely attach themselves and try to execute either malware or some sort of spyware or some sort of access points. Where do our vulnerabilities exist? So this then gave rise to the marketplace around folks like Tenable, Rapid7, and Qualys that provide vulnerability management, vulnerability detection services and software that allows you to determine when you have outdated systems that require patching, that are missing security updates, things of that nature. Then it became apparent that obviously wasn't enough, right? Because as innovation drives organizations to adopt newer technology, they tend to either leave behind or forget about some of those legacy systems that simply can't be updated as fast. And therefore, in and of itself, creates vulnerabilities in the environment. So that's when it gave rise to things like SIEM and log analysis. So security event information management solutions like ArcSight, probably the heavy hitter in the marketplace. Folks like Logarithm, for instance, that are appliance-based, sit inside the environment, and they're keeping track of all the activity that's occurring across all devices, but specifically correlating activity around devices with known vulnerabilities that need patches, and also identifying what users are doing, who's accessing what, and what they're doing once they have possession of files and applications and things of that nature. And unfortunately, these tools, while very robust and can alert in real time to a situation that an IT security professional should be aware of, they're often used more often than not in a more of a post-mortem sense, where something devastating has already taken place, and now they need to go back and retrace the steps of an intruder or an inside infiltrator. So once we realized that that wasn't enough, then we needed to understand that, okay, so the people in my environment whom I've given access to intentionally, we need to ensure that those folks actually are who they say they are. So now we have, personnel and ID management systems like OTA and SailPoint that are, enabling things like two-factor authentication anytime an individual within the organization wants to access a system, a device, file structure, or application. And so we're ensuring now that the insider threat is potentially minimized by ensuring that the folks that have been granted access actually are who they say they are. But if we see here that this posture is very much in a retreating pattern, right? The persistent threat comes from the outside initially. Once they're in, now they can get around inside the environment. So we keep getting closer and closer to the concept of needing to protect the data itself and less the network and the environment and the devices that hold the data, because ultimately, I think we'd have to admit that cybersecurity professionals are all but thrown in the towel as it relates to the breaches that we hear about pretty much on a weekly basis. Even very sophisticated cybersecurity teams, such as the one at Capital One, who are renowned in the marketplace for having a very mature, very prolific team that was able to put together quite a number of systems and devices that on the surface made them appear quite resilient to any outside attacks. So the persistence of threats obviously has gotten to the point where the data itself really needs to be self-protecting. And so I don't mean to diminish the use case of these cybersecurity tools that are in place. They certainly do stop a number of attacks that otherwise would have been easily successful. But what we're talking about here is considering that there's technology today, particularly with folks like Virtru and Acronis SCS, that will consolidate all of these tools that exist across a network and put it on the data itself, wrapping it in a package, as it were, so that the data is self-protecting. This is important for primarily two reasons as it relates to cloud migration projects, right? One is, if you intend to share your data outside of your network, which pretty much every organization needs to, you need to have the confidence that you have this wrapper around your data, that ability to control who sees it, who can share it, who can download it, who can copy it, who can augment it. You need to make sure that those capabilities are retained by your team as it exits and enters your environment. It's the only way to remain productive, but also secure. The other concept is, if you have that confidence that the data itself is self-protecting and that your team has full control and capability and visibility, more importantly, into where that data is being shared, who's accessing it, and so forth, it now gives you the ability to confidently migrate your systems and data to another infrastructure, a la the cloud. The other component here is once the data is self-protecting and you're confident that your most critical data, the things that you do not want leaked or shared with individuals who should not be seeing it, is in fact locked down and under your control at all times, whether it's, again, inside your organization or outside your organization, you then have no fear about backing up your data on a regular basis, because without self-protecting data, the attack surface gets increasingly larger when all you're doing is replicating data from a traditional backup and recovery standpoint. You have a number of classified file structures in your environment, and the concern is, well, if I'm just backing this up, how do I know that the backups of the critical data, are not being shared or stored somewhere erroneously or getting lost in my environment? If the data itself is self-protecting, then there's really no concern for ensuring that you have valid data files with integrity checks to ensure that there's been no tampering of your copies of your data. Horace, I think we'll turn it back over to you.
Yep, that sounds good. Thanks very much, John. To highlight some of the things that we've been talking about today, we'd love to jump into a couple of case studies in the state government space. At Virtru, we use DataCentric Encryption, similarly to what John was just talking about, to help Maryland in their digital cloud transformation. We gave their admins the tools to monitor and track data as it was moved to the cloud, and then also protected them from their third-party cloud providers by separating encrypted data and the keys that are used to access that data onto different systems. We also gave their end users the ability to continually protect data as it moves within and outside of their organization. We very much believe that with the right protection and access controls, all data can be migrated and shared. This led to many tactical benefits, including the fact that Maryland simply didn't need to break up their systems into two parts. They didn't need to have an on-premise version of their email and data and file infrastructure and also a cloud version of it. This quote here kind of exemplifies that it's much more efficient for our 44,000 users to have one email system. We've saved a great deal of time and resources internally. And Maryland is a great customer because they not only do they have 44,000 users and 25 different independent agencies, but like many other state and local education organizations, they touch HIPAA compliant. They fall under HIPAA compliance. They touch CGIS data. and are heavily regulated, but we're also able to make this cloud migration successfully and rather quickly as well.
So from our side, given the nature of what it is we do and the solutions and products we provide to our customer base, this use case is admittedly not flashy in terms of a logo or being able to quote somebody directly. If there's interest in learning more about this particular use case, after this webinar, please contact us and we can get you in touch with the individual who's willing to speak on our behalf. But in our case study, we had a major systems integrator use our solution to migrate a bunch of neighboring municipal county agencies in California, to a cloud-first environment. And one of the unique things about working with this group is that the integrator we worked with looked at backup and disaster recovery in somewhat of an abnormal light. They viewed it as somewhat of the foundation of a security posture for an organization. And what that means is folks are already doing backup and disaster recovery today under more of an operational assurance lens, which typically has budget dollars attached to it from an OpEx perspective. What this integrator is focused on doing is kind of flipping the paradigm to an extent and saying that you're already doing the backup, but you're not treating it as a weapon in your arsenal for supporting your security posture. If you're doing it right and you're leveraging the right tools and you have the right policy in place, then you are already light years ahead of folks that have added all of those other sorts of products that we talked about in previous slides related to keeping intruders out or keeping insider threats nullified. So for that reason, they're able to convince these counties here in California that from a cyber protection perspective, it made more sense for them to allocate enough CapEx where they could afford to buy the right tools, have an integrator implement the right policies, and set them up so that when they did migrate to the cloud, they were using this data-centric approach first, right? They were wrapping the data on-premise and then having the confidence that they could move it to the cloud by basically consolidating all these sorts of tools that exist in the marketplace and having it exist on the data itself. So that was one of the strategic decisions that intrigued us about working with this integrator in particular, is they had a very different way of thinking about how to move data around comfortably, whether it's from a physical infrastructure to a virtual infrastructure or inside or outside the organization, doesn't really matter. Their approach is to wrap the data and ensure that it's secure. So, one of the things that they did, or a couple of the things that they did, was, of course, to create full image baselines, pre-migration, right? Make sure that you have working copies with integrity checks that are encrypted, that are locked down, and that have full control of the IT team, so that at any point they need to move things back, or they need to retest some devices and file structures before they go live. They have working active copies of their file structures, so they wouldn't have any fear of losing data during a migration effort. The other component was replicating databases and power control systems. Obviously, these systems are very sensitive as it relates to their ability to have any downtime whatsoever. So enabling, hot copies essentially to be created on the fly, and that could be failed over to immediately, either during the transition or immediately after the transition, essentially cloning them and having them operate in a high availability capacity was important to this group. They also decided to add ransomware protection. And so when we talk about self-protecting data, obviously we know today that ransomware is a hot topic, especially among public sector customers as they become increasingly more targeted, is that you also want to automate the protection capabilities of your data as much as possible. So leveraging, machine learning and AI, things that exist today in the marketplace that did not 10 years ago, to help understand if and when a file structure is trying to be accessed, if and when an executable or a protocol is being kicked off, to augment or encrypt files on a device, particularly an administrative device where phishing attacks tend to be the most successful means for accessing systems. It's important to have a piece of software that sits on the workstation itself, constantly monitoring processes, and has the ability to actually stop an executable from running or from encrypting files when normally that process would not take place from that avenue, right? It's okay to keep encrypting things as the user of that workstation, but when an outside protocol attempts to encrypt, the capabilities inherent in the anti-ransomware protection allow for an immediate backup to be kicked off, as well as stopping that process and alerting the IT admins that this attempted encryption just took place. They were also able to add comprehensive disaster recovery plans, actual printouts that they could leave on the desk for multiple IT teams in case somebody was out of office when a situation occurred, outlining step-by-step how to go about recovering an entire system or file structure. And then also by migrating to the O365 platform, they recognize that even with their data sitting in a monolithic company's architecture like Microsoft, that they were still the custodians of their data, of their constituents' data, of their faculty data, and therefore they felt that they also needed an additional layer of protection by backing those file structures up in their entirety, so that when they needed to pull something back, they knew that it was secure, that it was in fact a backup that had not been tampered with, and that they were able to restore files, folders, contacts, mail items very easily, much quicker and easily than they would be able to using the O365 administrator's platform. So when you back up those structures, or if you're just trying to access them from the platform itself, you find that you just basically have to go through one entire folder through 6,000 to 10,000 emails to find the content you're looking for. So something that replicates the hierarchy that exists in a user's view is very helpful in reducing time and worrying about where these mailbox items could be replicated. So we covered a number of topics today, and we don't want to take too much more of your time. We do appreciate you joining us. Number one, if you think about the data-centric protection approach to cloud migration, is really, how can you ensure that the data itself is not only self-protecting, but it's self-protecting in an automated way, that once you assign policies to the software that's protecting that data, it's executing those flawlessly without human intervention that gives any capability for human error. Doing this will allow an organization to confidently and securely, and in a way that is documented, right, for an audit, that they have the confidence to migrate their data structures to a cloud repository, whether that's just a storage component or whether that is in a networking capacity, in an I/O capacity, whatever that might be. Leveraging platforms that exist today from a SaaS perspective is obviously extremely attractive from a budgetary standpoint. The challenge is what is the blueprint? How do you get there? How does an organization of a very large size get their arms around the massive amounts of data that they have? How do they prioritize it? Huayra mentioned a number of those steps you can take to begin that journey. But the key takeaway here is if you take a data-centric approach to pre-migration, during migration, and post-migration efforts, you're going to be much better off than worrying about putting the devices up there first and securing in the old fashion of having a perimeter defense around your environment. The other element is because you intend to share your data outside of organizations and or migrate it, you need to make sure that you have control and visibility at all times. So whether that means sharing PDFs, as Horace mentioned, ensuring that those things are locked down to policies that have been put in place and that other folks are not abusing their access to that file or that data, and of course moving it out of your infrastructure from an on-premise perspective, across the network and to a public cloud or even a private cloud infrastructure. Anytime you go to migrate something out of your environment, it clearly presents an opportunity for error. And the last piece is that while there's tons of tools out there in the marketplace, it doesn't matter how many tools or how great they are. Obviously, a combination of tools is going to be required, as there's no one solution that does all things necessary to successfully and securely migrate data. The other important piece of this is to add policy. So wherever there's a gap in tools, education of faculty and staff is important, and administering policies, not just to the folks that are managing the data, but also the data protection element itself.
John, Horace, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We do have time to take questions now from the attendees. A reminder, if you've not submitted questions yet by the chat window on your screen, you can do so now. I'm sure we won't have time to get to every question, but for those that we don't answer in the course of this session today, we will respond to them via email. That said, we've got some questions that have come through. John, Horace, first one I have for you. How does data-centric protection give me more visibility and control in the cloud?
John, I think I can take that one. So the question was, how does data-centric encryption give me more control and visibility? If we think about the 4 pillars of key management, there is one of the pillars there is authentication. Another pillar is authorization. So with a combination of authentication and authorization, organizations can track and identify when keys are being distributed for access of information in SaaS architecture. So if you think about, once a file has been shared with someone that is protected with data-centric encryption, they are ultimately added to the authentication policy, and then as they're authorized to view the file in subsequent access requests, we can actually give that telemetry back to the organization that's ultimately granting the file access through the key.
So, gentlemen, another question I have for you. Usability issues surrounding key management and poor workflows have resulted in hesitation in deploying encryption solutions for data protection. How have you seen companies successfully handle the change management with end users who might not be so tech savvy?
Yeah, I think I can take this one as well. We at Virtru have typically approached this in a two-prong approach. One is with a dedicated change management process. So that is people working with people to educate organizations and educate end users at organizations that are less tech savvy. We find that having that individual person touch is really important to making sure folks at organizations are getting the right type of attention. But there's another piece to that that Virtru stands on as well. It's been very, very important to us and has contributed to a large part of our success, which is building applications and building end user interfaces that educate end users and try to abstract business logic away from them and simply make them into end user logic that is centered around their workflows. So an example I'll give you is in the Virtru application, if a user does something that potentially triggers a data loss prevention rule, the application will immediately alert the user, hey, this piece of data that you're trying to share, in this case, this file that you're trying to share, has some sensitive content in it, and most specifically, it has social security number in it. Social security numbers are not allowed to be shared outside the organization without it being protected first. And then it allows the user to make a decision at that point. Do you want to send anyway, or do you want to encrypt and share at that point? We add friction. We add friction in that sharing step in an effort to educate the user, and we find that pretty much across all of our industries, and especially in state, local government, and education, that as users hit these educational messages, they start to learn, and they start to realize, oh, the last time I sent this document with a social security number in it, it got flagged. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and encrypt it now beforehand, so that I don't continue to see these extra messages. And it's through this minimal nudging that we're able to kind of educate users, and less tech savvy users start encrypting documents without even knowing that that's exactly what they're doing.
Horace, excellent response. Now, we've heard from two different companies today, but how do the two of you work together, and how can customers work with both of you?
That's a great question, and Horace, I'll take this one. So the way that I see it personally is that Virtru is great at preventing unwanted eyes, from viewing or controlling data, particularly outside of the organization, right, that was intended to be shared. Acronis SCS is very good at protecting data from unwanted protocols, right? Attempts to access it remotely, attempts to control it, encrypt it, what have you. So one of the things that I think we are capable of doing is providing joint assessments, right? A security posture as it relates to the data and how one organization would go about self-protecting its data. What tools are required. It might not even be that an Acronis SCS is the right solution or Virtru is the right solution. But we have folks on staff that do these assessments on a regular basis as a courtesy to organizations to understand whether or not there are things that could be leveraged today, whether they're already doing some things. And habitually what we find is that by tweaking their backup and restore policies a little bit, or adding an element like Virtru's data sharing protection mechanisms, that they can get a long way to further their fight against unwanted access. But I would also invite any attendees to obviously contact us to explore more of the case studies that we have available, and so we can outline in more detail as to how our engagement with our customer base has gone and the benefits that they've experienced as a result.
John, another question for you. You talked about there not being a roadmap for cloud migration. So where do you recommend we focus our efforts first?
Another solid question, and this is something we get quite a bit, especially when approaching enterprise organizations around migration efforts in particular. And that's whether it's migrating from physical architecture to more of a hybrid or a fully virtual environment, as well as cloud migrations. So the first step is above and beyond all else is to take inventory of the systems and the data within the organization. So we do something like we provide a very comprehensive questionnaire that is designed to be shared amongst many levels within an organization to ID and prioritize systems, and also forcing IT administrators and security personnel to engage with system stakeholders. And what we found is that when they go through something like a questionnaire that we provide, they uncover elements of their environment that they really weren't even aware of, and that they certainly were not protecting in a secure capacity. So doing something like an inventory check, having a guided questionnaire, professional services to potentially come in and do an assessment, these are things that are going to help facilitate any major project undertaking as it relates to migration. Getting your arms around the stuff in your environment first, assessing whether or not it is today secure, how to then secure it, and then make a plan to go ahead and migrate.
And final question I have for you. You talked about the persistence of threats and the evolution of protecting data. If you were to project, what do you think is next?
Well, I think that as data proliferation expands, the adoption of self-protecting data mechanisms, policies, and tools will really have to become more widely adopted. I think we're going to get away from that model of the outside-in defense, concentric circle, perimeter, moat, and castle across the environment, and again, consolidating it down onto the data itself. In the future, I really believe that as we migrate more and more to cloud SaaS models, IaaS models, in the future, there will really be three types of vendors that exist in the space. A lot of these other folks that provide all these different very niche products and capabilities will eventually be forced to consolidate, whether that's by acquisition or combining technologies. But what I'll see is that there will basically be, in its most important phase, the platform, right? And we're already seeing this with O365. This is the platform I use to run my organization from a communication perspective, both internally and externally to the environment. We also see that then there will be application-specific vendors, right, that are going to fill a very specific need, like a Workday for human resources, Salesforce for customer relationship management, and so forth. But they'll all be consolidated and run from the platform. And then there's going to be the ever-important protection element. What level of protection is going to exist for the applications, the platform, the data, and the users accessing all these things? Everything else, I think, in time will have been consolidated into this vision, where you will just see these three elements essentially. And there will always be the need, of course, for storage, and that's not to say that there won't be an AWS in the future, but certainly I think Microsoft has the leg up moving forward with being the platform of choice for organizations to migrate to effectively operate their organizations.
Well, very good, John, Horace. I want to thank you both for your time and insight today, and especially for making time to answer these questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Yep.
And of course, I want to thank our attendees as well. You all took time out of your day to attend this session, and we're grateful. I do trust that today's discussion provided some valuable new data points, new insight to enable you and your organization to be even better prepared to tackle the cloud data management issues we discussed here today. I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming events. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you very much.